Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are stepping into what feels like, well, a silence. We're looking at a period of history that usually gets treated like a blank page in a notebook.
Right.
You know, the part you just skip over to get to the real action.
It's the flyover country of Caribbean history, isn't it? Just this gap between two major events.
Exactly. We always hear about Columbus arriving in 1494, causing all this havoc, and the boom, smash cut to 1655. The British fleet arrives, and what we think of as modern Jamaican history begins.
But that smash cut, it just erases, 120 years?
120 years, that's 4 generations. It's an entire era of human experience, of lives lived, that just vanishes from the popular story.
Yeah, it's often called the quiet century. But, and this is what we're really getting into today, silence is not the same thing as peace. And it is certainly not the same thing as emptiness.
We're digging into the file we're calling Forgotten Colony, Unquiet Spirits. We're looking at Spanish Jamaica between, 1534 and 1655.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive is to really explore the paradox of the Backwater. We want to try and understand what happens to a colony when the empire, for all intents and purposes, basically stops caring.
That is the absolute central tension here. I mean, we're so used to stories of empire being about, aggressive expansion, gold, massive fleets, constant micromanagement from the metropole.
Right, the crown is always watching.
But Spanish Jamaica was the complete opposite. It was a story of contraction, of poverty, and of neglect. But, and this is the crucial part we have to get our heads around, that neglect created a very specific, a very volatile kind of chemistry.
And that's the idea of benign neglect, right? That's the term you hear thrown around.
We need to be so careful with that term, though. Benign suggests it was harmless or even good.
For whom, though?
Exactly. For the Spanish crown, ignoring Jamaica was a strategic choice, a business decision, really. It just wasn't worth the investment compared to the silver mines of Peru or the huge markets of Mexico.
It wasn't making the money.
Not in the way they cared about, but for the people left on the island. The dwindling population of Spanish settlers, the Taino survivors who were, supposedly extinct, and the enslaved Africans being brought in, that so-called neglect meant the rules of the game were totally different.
Different how? What does that actually look like on the ground?
Well, think of it this way. The walls were lower, the surveillance was weaker. When the master, the king in Spain, is staring intently at Mexico, he isn't looking at the Blue Mountains of Jamaica.
He's not paying attention.
He's not. And that lack of attention created a crack in the system, a space where people at the very bottom of the social ladder could breathe, could organize, and eventually could fight back in a way that just wasn't possible in the heavily militarized, high-value colonies.
So settle in. We're going to walk through the dusty plazas of a failing capital city. We're going to ride through the cattle ranches of the southern savannas, and then we're going to climb into those limestone hills where a new kind of society was being incubated, almost in secret.
In the dark.
This is the real story of Spanish Jamaica's backwater years.
And I think we have to start with a retreat, with a failure, really. We have to look at why the Spanish packed up and moved their capital in the first place.
Right. So in our last discussion, we touched on Sevilla la Nueva, New Seville, up on the north coast. It was supposed to be the jewel of the island.
Supposed to be.
It ended up being a graveyard.
It was a catastrophic failure of, you could call it urban planning, but it was more basic than that. It was a failure to understand the environment. You have to picture this. It's, say, 1533. You're a Spanish settler in Sevilla.
Okay.
You are living right next to a mangrove swamp. The heat is absolutely stifling, suffocating. But the real enemy, the thing that's killing everyone, is microscopic.
Disease, it had to be.
Rampant, unchecked disease. We're talking about dysentery, almost certainly malaria coming in, and just a host of various fevers that the Europeans had absolutely no immunity to. And it was decimating the indigenous workforce they relied on.
So the whole project is grinding to a halt.
It's dying on the vine. The mortality rate was so high, children weren't surviving infancy. The governor is writing these desperate letters back to the king in Spain, saying, if we stay here, there will be no one left to govern. The colony will cease to exist.
So it's an ultimatum, basically, move or die.
Pretty much. And so in 1534, the royal treasurer, a man named Pedro de Mazuelo, he makes the call. He pulls the plug on Sevilla la Nueva.
And he's the one who scouts the new location.
He is. And notice the direction he goes. He completely turns his back on the north coast, which is the logistical connection to Spain and the rest of the empire, right?
That's where the ships come in.
That's where they're supposed to come in.
Yeah.
But he crosses the central mountain range and goes south. He finds this broad, flat, alluvial plain near the Rio Copre.
And this becomes Villa de la Vega.
Later, much later, known as Spanish Town. Now, let's really dig into the mechanics of this move, because it wasn't just, let's find a nicer neighborhood with a better breeze.
It was more strategic than that.
It was an act of desperation, an attempt to find a landscape that actually functioned for them. The south was drier, the air was clearer, but crucially, the land was already cleared.
By the Taino.
Yeah.
For centuries.
Exactly. This is so important. The Spanish didn't hack Villa de la Vega out of some primordial jungle. They didn't pioneer anything. They built their new capital directly on top of existing agricultural lands that the Taino had been farming for generations.
It's a parasitic move.
It is entirely parasitic. They needed the food security that the South provided. They were basically colonizing an existing infrastructure.
So they set up this new capital. And I think, when we hear capital city of a Spanish colony, our minds immediately go to these grand images, huge cathedrals, paved streets, bustling markets.
You need to shrink that image way, way down. Just take that grand picture in your head and reduce it by about 90%.
So it wasn't like that at all.
Not even close. Villa de la Vega was a village trying to dress up as a city. I mean, yes, they laid it out on a grid. That was a classic Spanish obsession with imposing order on the world. They marked out a central square, the Plaza Mayor.
Yeah, the standard layout.
The standard layout. They designated a spot for the abbey. They built the governor's house out of brick, which was a big deal. But if you walked just 2 streets away from that central square, you're in the bush. The jungle is right there.
So it's a facade, a thin veneer of civilization.
It's a performance of power. The grid is meant to represent the crown's authority, right? It says, we are imposing logic and order on this savage land. But the day-to-day reality was that pigs were roaming the streets. The roads turned into impassable mud bogs in the rainy season.
And the population was tiny.
Unbelievably small. At its absolute height during this entire 120-year period, we are talking about maybe 500 to 1,000 Europeans on the entire island.
Wow, that is shockingly small. It's barely a town.
It's a hamlet, a remote, isolated outpost. But, and this is the absolute key to understanding the brutality of the period, the small size didn't change the power structure.
That's what really stood out to me in the sources. You move the capital, you change the geography, you get away from the diseases of the north, but the fundamental cruelty remains constant.
Because the system didn't change. The Spanish brought the encomienda system with them from the north coast to the south. And we should probably unpack that a bit because it's the real engine of the whole colonial project.
Yes, please, let's do that. Because I think people hear slavery and they immediately think of the later British model, the huge sugar plantations. But encomienda it's a different beast.
It is. It's a bit more feudal in a way. The encomienda wasn't technically a land grant. It was a labor grant. The King of Spain would grant a Spaniard and encomendero the right to the forced labor of a specific group of indigenous people.
A grant for people, not property.
Exactly. In exchange, the Spaniard was supposed to protect them and, instruct them in the Catholic faith.
Protect them. That has to be one of the heaviest euphemisms in history.
It was a complete legal fiction for feudal servitude. It was slavery in all but name. So in Villa de la Vega, this meant that the few surviving Taino communities were forced to build the church. They were forced to till the fields for the Spanish and herd the cattle for the new ranches.
So the location changed, but the actual lived experience of the oppressed
was identical. The dynamic of I own your labor and by extension you owe me your life remained absolute and unchanged.
And watching over all of this is the church. In a backwater like Jamaica, how powerful is the church, really? Is it just as neglected as the rest of the colony's infrastructure?
It's a really interesting and complex duality. On the one hand, yes, the church in Jamaica was poor. I mean, dirt poor. The abbot was constantly writing letters back to Spain, begging for funds to repair the roof of the abbey, to buy candles, to pay the priests a living wage.
So financially, it's weak.
Financially, it's on its knees. But politically, the abbot was often the only check on the governor's power, the only other source of authority on the island.
So you end up with a rivalry.
A bitter personal one. In a tiny town where everyone knows everyone else's business, the feud between the church and the state completely dominates social and political life. The abbot uses the pulpit on Sunday to denounce the governor's corruption or his immorality.
And the governor's response?
The governor threatens to arrest the priests for treason. It's incredibly petty, small-town politics, but with literal life or death stakes for the indigenous and African people who are caught in the middle of these power struggles.
It sounds claustrophobic, just suffocating.
That is the perfect word for it. Villa de la Vega was a pressure cooker. You have this small group of Spanish men, mostly soldiers, minor officials, guys who feel completely trapped.
This wasn't the dream they were sold.
Not at all. They came to the New World to get rich, to be like Cortez in Mexico, and instead they're stuck in this dusty, forgotten town in Jamaica, watching their clothes literally rot off their bodies in the humidity, with no gold, no silver, no glory to be found.
Let's pivot to that no gold reality, because that seems to be the single defining economic feature of this entire century.
It is the reason for the silence from Spain. It's everything. The Spanish spent the first 20, 30 years frantically prospecting. They dug mines in the Blue Mountains. They panned all the major rivers. They tortured Taino caciques to find out where the gold was hidden.
And they found nothing.
Well, they found trace amounts. Just enough to keep the hope alive for a little while, but nothing that could be extracted profitably. And the moment the official report went back to Seville, saying definitively, there is no gold in Jamaica, the island effectively died in the eyes of the royal treasury.
All attention, all investment shifts to the crown jewels, to Mexico and Peru.
Correct. Jamaica became a line item in the budget that cost the crown money rather than making it. And this led to a massive brain drain, or maybe you could call it a greed drain.
I like that.
Any Spaniard with a shred of ambition or capital left, they hopped on the first ship to Havana or Veracruz to try and make their fortune where the real action was.
So who stayed behind? Who are the people running this colony?
The failures, the debtors, the minor sons of minor nobility who had no prospects back in Spain and nowhere else to go. The soldiers assigned to the tiny garrison who couldn't afford to bribe their commanding officer to get transferred somewhere better.
And the encomenderos.
And of course, the encomenderos who had sunk their last remaining wealth into buying cattle and couldn't leave without losing everything they had. It's a colony run by the B team.
Or the C team, maybe?
Honestly, yeah. And this lack of oversight from the crown is absolutely crucial. In a major colony like Mexico, the crown sent inspectors, the residencia, to conduct regular and very thorough audits of the governors.
To keep them honest.
Or to at least limit their theft. In Jamaica, the inspectors almost never came. It simply wasn't worth the cost of the trip.
So the governor is basically a warlord on his own little island?
He is a king in his own little fiefdom. He can smuggle goods, he can ignore royal decrees, he can abuse the law, he can treat the colonial treasury as his personal piggy bank. Corruption wasn't a bug in the system. It was the only way the local Spanish economy functioned at all.
But, okay, people still have to eat. The colony managed to survive for 120 years. If there's no gold, what is the economy actually built on?
The economy becomes, in a word, pastoral. When the mining dream dies, the ranching reality begins. And this brings us to the rise of the great herds.
Cows and pigs.
On a scale that is genuinely hard for us to imagine today, the Spanish introduced cattle and pigs in the very early 1500s. With virtually no natural predators and endless savanna grasslands, the populations just exploded.
We're talking feral animals.
Completely feral. We are talking about tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of wild cattle and pigs roaming the southern plains and the foothills of the mountains. A massive self-replenishing source of protein.
So the whole economy shifts from digging holes in the ground to chasing cows.
It does. It becomes a provisioning colony. And here are the mechanics of it. The great Spanish treasure fleets, the flota that were carrying all the silver from Mexico and Peru back to Spain, they needed food. They couldn't make that transatlantic voyage on empty stomachs.
And Jamaica becomes the grocery store for the fleet.
It becomes the truck stop on the highway of the empire. But they're not selling fresh produce.
Right, it wouldn't last. So what are they selling specifically? You can't ship a fresh side of beef across the Atlantic in the 16th century.
You sell three main things: hides, lard, and cassava bread. Let's look at the hides first, because that's probably the most valuable export. In 16th century Europe, leather is. It's like plastic is for us today. It's used for everything.
Everything.
Armor, horse tack, saddles, machinery belts for early industry, book bindings, shoes, buckets. There was this absolutely insatiable hunger for leather in Europe, and it was fueled by the constant wars.
So a cow that lived and died in Jamaica ends up as a soldier's belt in a war in Flanders.
Exactly that. The Jamaican ranchers, the hatos, would organize these huge hunts. They'd hunt the feral cattle, often just killing them for the skin and leaving the carcass to rot to process and export the hides.
And the lard.
Lard, manteca. They would boil down the fat from the pigs and cattle. This was the primary cooking oil of the entire Caribbean. Every ship, every settlement needed barrels and barrels of lard to function.
Okay, so hides and lard. What about the meat itself?
This is where we see indigenous technology basically saving the Spanish colony. The Spanish called the product tasajo. We would know it as the direct ancestor of jerk.
Now, I want to get the technical details right here for our listeners. We are not talking about spicy chicken on a grill with pimento wood.
No, not yet. This is a preservation technology that jerk cooking evolved from. We're talking about pure preservation chemistry. The Taino technique involved using a wooden grate and what they called a barbacoa to slow smoke meat over a low fire of green pimento wood.
And the smoke is key.
The smoke is everything. It creates an antibacterial seal on the meat. It dries it out completely, removing all the moisture that bacteria need to grow.
So it's basically an organic hardtack, a meat biscuit.
Its survival fuel is protein that can last for months. The Spanish industrialized this process. They would have their enslaved laborers slaughter the cattle, strip the meat into long, thin sheets, salt it very heavily, and then smoke it over these barbacoas until it was as hard as a wooden plank.
No.
You could throw a sack of this stuff into the dark, damp hold of a ship, and it would still be edible 6 months later when you got to Spain.
So Jamaica isn't sending gold bars to the king, it's sending calories and leather?
It's sending calories and raw materials. But now, think about what this kind of economy requires. It doesn't require thousands of men chained together in a deep mine shaft.
No.
It requires hunters, it requires cowboys, it requires people who can track animals through the bush.
It requires mobility and skill.
Bingo. To run a ranching economy in the Jamaican interior, you have to give your labor force weapons. You have to give them knives, lances, maybe even a musket. And you have to give them a horse or a mule.
And you have to trust them.
You have to let them go out of your sight, sometimes for days or weeks at a time, to track and round up the herds.
That sounds incredibly risky. If I'm an enslaved person and my master gives me a machete, a horse, and tells me to go into the woods and come back in a week,
It is the single greatest risk the Spanish took. It is the leaky system. The very nature of the island's economy made the kind of strict, centralized control you saw in other colonies impossible. The Spanish needed independent, skilled laborers to manage the herds.
and those laborers.
And those laborers, Africans and the remaining Taino, used that independence, that mobility, to learn the land, to map it in their minds, to become experts in their environment.
This brings us right to the huge demographic shift that's happening at the same time. The vanishing and the arriving. We have to address the Taino population. The standard textbook line is just extinct by 1550. Full stop.
That is the myth of extinction. And it's a very convenient and dangerous myth because it completely erases survival and resistance. The demographic collapse was undeniably apocalyptic. We're talking about a population decline of 90%, maybe even more, due to the disease vectors we talked about earlier.
A 90% decline is catastrophic.
It's almost unimaginable, but 90% is not 100%.
So who is left? Where are they?
They're in remnants, small pockets of communities that retreated deeper into the mountains. But also, and perhaps more commonly, they are individuals and families integrated into Spanish households. The Spanish had a category called naborias.
What does that mean?
It meant indigenous people who were bound to a lifetime of service, but not technically chattel slaves. By the mid-1500s, the large, pure Taino villages of the past were fading, but the people were still there, often living in the barrios on the outskirts of Spanish town or on the rancherias themselves.
And this is precisely when the first Africans arrive in significant numbers.
Yes. The first enslaved Africans were brought in specifically to replace the dying indigenous labor force. But in Jamaica, because the economy was so poor, the numbers were initially very small. We are not talking about the mass importation of the British sugar era yet. Not even close. We're talking about small groups, maybe a few dozen on each ship.
And this leads to a very specific and I think often overlooked intersection that our sources really highlight. The Taino and the Africans are not kept in separate worlds.
No, they're thrown together. They are living in the same barracks on the ranches. They are working side by side in the slaughterhouses. They are suffering under the whip of the same encomendero. And inevitably, they are forming alliances. They are forming families.
So you have the creation of mixed households.
Absolutely. The Spanish, with their obsession for racial categorization, had all these names for the children of these unions, Zambos, Pardos. But the reality on the ground was a fusion of cultures, knowledge, and bloodlines.
And this is a really profound deep dive insight here, I think.
It is. The culture of resistance in Jamaica wasn't just African, and it wasn't just Taino. It was Afro-Indigenous from its very earliest moments.
What does that exchange look like in practical, everyday terms?
It looks like an African man who has just arrived from, say, the Congo, learning from a Taino woman which roots in the forest are edible and which ones are poison. It looks like a Taino hunter teaching an African herdsman how to navigate the treacherous limestone karst landscape without breaking a leg.
It's the small things.
It's the blending of culinary techniques, the pepper pot, the use of cassava. It's sharing knowledge of medicinal plants. It's a transfer of technology.
Survival technology.
That's exactly what it is. It's a transfer of survival technology. The Africans brought their own agricultural genius, their knowledge of ironworking, their own spiritual traditions. The Taino provided the operating system for the island. They knew the landscape. They knew where the fresh water was hidden. They knew the secret cave systems.
And that shared knowledge is incredibly dangerous to the Spanish.
It is the most dangerous weapon in the world. Because once your enslaved population knows the land better than you, the masters do, the entire balance of power begins to shift.
Which leads us directly to the unquiet spirits, to the act of resistance. We've talked about the economic leaks in the system. Now let's talk about the physical leaks. Let's talk about maroonage.
The term maroon itself comes from the Spanish word cimarrón. It was a word they originally used for runaway cattle that had gone wild in the hills.
So they were applying a term for livestock to people.
They were. It meant wild, untamed, of the mountaintop. But in Jamaica, maroonage takes on a very specific and formidable character because of the island's unique geography.
The terrain here is it's something else.
Have you ever seen pictures of the cockpit country?
I have. It looks like a giant green egg cart made of stone. It's bewildering.
It is a geological fortress. It's a landscape made of limestone karst. What that means is you have these deep circular sinkholes separated by incredibly steep, jagged ridges, all covered in dense, almost impenetrable jungle. And there's no surface water because it all drains straight underground into cave systems.
So for a Spanish soldier in heavy metal armor or a cavalryman on a horse,
it's a death trap. It's impossible terrain. You can't fight in formation. You can't bring supplies. You get lost in minutes. It is a green hell for any conventional army.
but for someone who knows the hidden paths, for someone who grew up there.
It's a sanctuary, it's a fortress. And the first Maroons, these early Afro-Indigenous groups, they didn't just run away aimlessly into the woods, they migrated strategically into these blank spots on the Spanish maps. They established communities in the very places where the Spanish physically could not go.
So they're not just hiding, they're building a counter-society.
Exactly. This is state building in the shadows. They are clearing land for planting, they are building huts, they are electing their own leaders, they are creating a new society with its own rules, completely outside of Spanish control.
And the Spanish can't stop them?
They can't, because the Spanish military presence was so laughably weak, remember, that backwater status? They couldn't spare the hundreds of soldiers, the battalions that would be needed to root them out.
So what did they do? They must have tried something.
Oh, they would send a punitive expedition, a quadrilla they called it. A small militia squad of maybe 20 or 30 men. They'd hike into the foothills for a day or two, get shot at with arrows or poisoned darts from the dense brush, maybe lose a few men, get hopelessly lost, run out of water, and then they'd turn back and declare victory.
And after a while,
the governor in Spanish Town just shrugs. The unofficial policy became, as long as they stay up in the hills and don't come down to burn the capital, let them rot up there.
there's that benign neglect again, but this time applied to resistance.
Let them go! But that was a fatal, fatal strategic error. By letting them go, they allowed the resistance to consolidate. They allowed the Maroons to map the entire interior of the island, to create a sophisticated network of trails, lookout posts, and provision grounds.
They were basically incubating their own defeat.
They absolutely were. They were allowing a standing army of guerrilla fighters to form and train in their own backyard.
I want to spend a moment on the spiritual aspect of this resistance because the title of our deep dive is Unquiet Spirits. We've talked a lot about the physical survival. What about spiritual survival?
This is, of course, harder to see in the archaeological record, but it's everywhere in the folklore and the oral histories that have been passed down. You have to remember, the Spanish imposed Catholicism with absolute, unwavering rigidity.
There was no religious freedom.
Zero. You had to be baptized, you had to attend Mass. The Inquisition, even if it was a weak, underfunded version in Jamaica, was still a threat. Heresy was a crime.
So how do you keep your own beliefs, your ancestral traditions alive in that environment?
You camouflage them, you hide them in plain sight. This is the great age of syncretism. You take your African deity, let's say a warrior spirit like Ogun. and you hide him inside the statue of a Catholic warrior saint like St. James the Moorslayer, who was very popular.
So you're praying to the statue in the church.
You're praying to the statue, and the priest sees you and thinks, what a good, devout Catholic. But in your mind, in your heart, you are praying to your ancestor, to your own God, for the strength to fight and defeat your oppressors.
The secret language of faith.
It's a profound act of spiritual resistance. It's a way of maintaining your own cosmology, your own sense of self, under the heel of the empire. And you have to think about the physical setting, too. The Spanish often deliberately built their churches on top of existing Taino sacred sites, places where zemis were worshipped or ancient burial grounds.
To physically stamp out the old religion.
To dominate it, to show that their god had conquered the old gods, but for the people forced to worship there.
So when you are kneeling in the church in Spanish Town,
you are kneeling on the bones of the indigenous ancestors. And the African worshiper knows this. The Taino survivor knows this. The unquiet spirits are literally under the floorboards of the church. The resistance isn't just happening out in the hills, it's right there in the nave, in the whispers during the liturgy, in the secret meaning behind the prayers.
That is an incredibly haunting image. The Spanish think they have conquered and pacified the island, but they are just sitting on top of this spiritual volcano of memory and resistance.
And by the mid-1600s, that volcano is starting to rumble. It's ready to blow. And the thin, brittle shell of Spanish colonial rule is getting thinner and thinner every year.
Let's move to that period then, the eve of invasion. It's, say, 1650. What is the actual state of the colony on the ground?
It is rotting. That is honestly the only word for it. The Spanish population has stagnated or even declined. The main fort at Caguaya, what is now Passage Fort, is literally crumbling into the sea. The cannons are rusted solid. The gunpowder is damp and useless.
Who's even in charge?
The governor is likely an invalid or an idiot or both, because no competent or ambitious administrator in the Spanish Empire would ever take the posting in Jamaica. It was a career dead end.
And meanwhile, the rest of the world is changing. The English are on the rise.
The entire geopolitics of the Caribbean are shifting under Spain's feet. Spain is overextended, bankrupt from European wars, and England, under the radical Protestant government of Oliver Cromwell, is hungry.
And battle-hardened.
Extremely. Cromwell has just finished his brutal civil war in England and Ireland. He has this massive, professional, battle-hardened army and a powerful navy, and he wants to use it to hurt Catholic Spain and enrich England.
And this is what becomes known as the Western Design.
That was the code name for the operation. The plan was audaciously simple. Sail a massive fleet to the Caribbean and rip the heart out of the Spanish Empire. Seize a major colony.
But, and this is one of those funny contingent moments in history, Jamaica wasn't the target.
No, not at all. Jamaica was the backup plan, the consolation prize. The real target was the island of Hispaniola, specifically the city of Santo Domingo, the oldest and most prestigious Spanish settlement in the Americas, the seat of their power.
So the English fleet arrives there first in early 1655, expecting an easy victory. And they get absolutely thrashed, humiliated. The Spanish in Santo Domingo, who the English thought were decadent and weak, fought back with unexpected ferocity. The English invasion was a disaster. They lost thousands of men to disease and Spanish lancers in the jungle.
So the commanders, Admiral Penn and General Venables, are terrified.
Terrified. They know that if they sail back to Cromwell in London with nothing but a story of defeat, they might literally lose their heads.
So they're sitting on their ships, licking their wounds, totally desperate, and they're looking at the map.
And they say, okay, what's the easiest target we can find? Is there anything soft nearby? Is there anything weak? And they point their finger at Jamaica.
The Backwater.
The ghost colony. The place nobody cared about. They knew it was poorly defended. They knew it was neglected. It was the low-hanging fruit. So they turned the prows of their ship south.
It just perfectly emphasizes the ultimate cost of that century of neglect, doesn't it? Spain spent 120 years ignoring Jamaica, treating it as a throwaway pantry. And when the predator finally arrived, the pantry door was wide open and unlocked.
When the English fleet appeared off what is now Kingston Harbor in May of 1655, the Spanish simply could not mount a defense. They had no manpower, they had no working cannons, they had no morale. The governor surrendered the capital almost immediately.
But, and this is the incredible cliffhanger that sets up the next phase of our story, the surrender of the Spanish governor was not the surrender of the island of Jamaica.
No.
And this is where that quiet century pays its astonishing dividend for the cause of freedom. The Spanish settlers, most of them fled to Cuba, but the enslaved Africans, the Afro-Indigenous laborers on the ranches, And most importantly, the established Maroon communities in the hills, they didn't surrender.
They saw the chaos of the invasion as an opportunity.
A massive opportunity. They saw the English not as liberators, they knew better than that, but as a new and perhaps weaker enemy. But this time, they were ready. They had spent a century preparing for this moment without even knowing it.
They had the knowledge.
They had the knowledge of the caves and the mountain passes. They had stockpiles of food. They had established social networks and military leadership. When the Spanish colonial administration collapsed overnight, the Maroons were the only coherent power left on the island. They stepped right into that vacuum.
So the English thought they had conquered a weak, empty Spanish colony.
And instead, they had unwittingly walked straight into a war with the unquiet spirits of the land. They would spend the next 80 years fighting a brutal, bloody guerrilla war against the very people that the Spanish had ignored into existence.
That is the ultimate legacy of this forgotten time, isn't it?
Uh.
It wasn't empty at all. It was an incubator.
It was. The 120 years of Spanish neglect allowed a unique and incredibly resilient resistance culture to harden like concrete in the sun. If Spain had properly developed Jamaica with massive sugar plantations and huge garrisons like they had elsewhere, the Maroons might never have been able to establish such a powerful foothold.
The backwater status was the key.
It's exactly what made the future resistance possible. The weakness of the colonizer created the strength of the resistance.
So what does this mean for us then, for you, the listener, today? What's the big takeaway?
I think it forces us to rethink what we consider important in history. We're always drawn to the golden ages, the booms, the big battles, but sometimes the most important foundational work happens in the recession. It happens in the quiet periods of neglect. It happens in the shadows where the eye of the empire isn't looking.
The silence is where the real strength is built.
Precisely. The Spanish Empire is long gone. Villa de la Vega is now just a neighborhood in a modern Jamaican city. But the Maroons, the descendants of those unquiet spirits who forged a society in the hills, they are still there. They still possess their land. In the end, they won the long game.
That is a truly powerful place to pause this part of the story. The storm has arrived, the English have landed, the Spanish are running for their lives, but the hills are watching.
And the hills are armed.
We are going to see exactly what happens when that century of incubated resistance explodes into open warfare in our next deep dive. The quiet century is officially over. The noise is about to begin.
It's going to be a chaotic, bloody, and absolutely fascinating transition of power.
Thank you for journeying into the shadows with us. This story of the Spanish backwater is, I think, a vital reminder that even when history seems to be holding its breath, it's actually preparing to scream.
History never sleeps. It just waits.
If you found value in this deep dive, make sure you are subscribed to the ABENG Signal. That way you won't miss the next chapter when we drop it. We'll be covering the English invasion of 1655 and the birth of the Great Maroon Wars.
You really will not want to miss it.
Let's keep the signal strong. See you on the next chapter.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.